Welcome to this really important, this discussion of a really important book. So it's a huge pleasure to be here, and a huge pleasure to welcome all of you and our panel, and a huge congratulations to the authors, Hugh Beynon and Ray Hudson, and to Verso for publishing the book. So what I wanted to do, just first explain a bit about the logic of the event, time-wise and organizationally, the logistics. So I was going to just introduce the speakers and maybe raise one or two questions for them to address, and then for them, Hugh and Ray, to introduce the book, and then secondly to get Laura Pidcock to respond and give her thoughts about the book from her own experiences too, and then hand back to Hugh and Ray with any comments on what Laura's said, and then that'll give us 25 minutes, half an hour for you to ask for your questions to be addressed. So please put questions in the comments section you can see on your screen. Make them succinct and relevant, because otherwise they'll be edited and there's more chance of getting them all in if you're succinct. And then Ralph Pritchard, who we must also thank for the logistics and sort of technical part of this event, will collate them, and then I'll read 7 minutes worth of them, and then Hugh and Ray will respond, and Laura too, and then we'll come back and maybe have another 3 minutes of questions or comments, and then go to a final comment by the panelists. So what I wanted to do in just opening this event is really to stress the distinctive importance of this book. To me, this isn't just another book launch, much as any book launch is important. But I think, so I must just turn my phone off. So I think one of the excellent reviews of this book, and it's getting a lot of good reviews, including a brilliant review from Laura Pidcock in Red Pepper. So one of them was from David Edgerton in the Times Literary Supplement, and he began it. I think he must have written it very soon after the Hartlepool election, and he said Labour's defeat there has led to much factional agitation, with some blaming it on a former leader, Jeremy Corbyn, who in fact held the seat in 2019. Hugh Beynon and Ray Hudson, who've spent years studying the deindustrializing communities, writing before the by-election, see it very differently. Their brilliant analysis of the decline of British coal mining and its social and political effects is required reading for those who would speak for this working class. So I don't know if there are many in the audience who are speaking or claim to speak for the working class, but I hope so. But anyway, the importance of that quote is that it both stresses the importance and significance of this book for now, for our thinking and strategy for going beyond the sort of impasse that the left is in. And I think Laura particularly will take that further, but so will the two authors. But secondly, it also stresses the importance of that historical perspective, that long view. So I'll hand over immediately to Hugh Beynon and Ray Hudson. And they're both, there's a bit of squeaking, but I hope it's not me. They're both emeritus professors, one of social science at Cardiff University, that's Hugh. Ray Hudson of geography at the University of Durham, and that's Ray. And Hugh, I'd also like to mention Hugh's book, which many of you will have read or heard of, Working for Ford. And in some ways, I think this book is going to be as important in understanding the nature of the working class and the problems and challenges and brutality that it faces, but also its capacity for agency and for constantly rebuilding and reorganizing, and its creativity and capacity. So the two questions I have for Hugh and Ray are, firstly, can you just say something about why you wrote this particular book? What led you to do this? And secondly, when you did it, where you say something about the process, and in particular, you both of you incredibly knowledgeable about the coalfields, but was there anything that surprised you, and that you hadn't anticipated? So over to you, and then I'll just introduce Laura. So Laura Pidcock, I haven't got a sort of formal description, but to me she's just an incredible sort of creative force in the Labour Party, and very sadly she lost her seat, but for reasons that relate very closely to what Hugh and Ray are analysing, and she'll say more about that. Now she's continuing her organising, both as a Unite organiser, a political officer rather, and through the Labour Party. So we're really, really pleased. She's absolutely the perfect person to respond and to comment on this. So Hugh and Ray, over to you.
Yes, Laura's wonderful. So why did we write the book? Well, there's a number of reasons, really, and I think we've been thinking about it for some time, and the quote from David gives a sense of how important it might be to consider how an industry that was once the source of all of the energy in the UK economy, quite central to British capitalism, was taken apart in the space of about 30 years between 1965 and 1995. And thinking about that, we thought that South Wales and Durham would be good exemplars of this change, of what's happened, partly because they were central to the coalfield when it was in its heyday. They were the main exporting coalfields. They dominated coal sales around the world when they were in their heyday, and they're the coalfields that felt the crash of closure most radically. They're also coalfields, incidentally, that we both know quite well, because I was born and brought up in South Wales and moved to spend 15 years in Durham, where I met Ray, and Ray, of course, has lived most of his life in the northeast. So it's something we know quite well, and we have a deep kind of affection for the places. But what's sparked us into life, if you like, was the referendum in 2015, and the fact that these two places, and if you remember, Sunderland and Ebbw were picked out. I think Clark visited Ebbw to find out why the workers had lost their mind. Figured centrally in the discussion of that, in which these areas had voted to leave. And we felt that the way in which their voting was being interpreted very pejoratively in terms of the characters of the people, or the character of the people in these areas, needed some kind of redress. And a way of doing it, we thought, would be to produce what, as a way of understanding these places, would be to produce a long story of how these places, highly organized within trade unions very early on, deeply involved in support for the Labour Party, deeply committed to the idea of the state intervening to regulate the industry and to support the welfare of workers. How is it that these workers and these people, their descendants, in areas which have long institutional memory, chose to vote for Leave and consequently maybe vote not to vote for Labour? Is that about right, Ray?
Hugh, I missed some of that, so I'm not quite sure what you said. My internet went down on it. But I think, broadly speaking, I think what you were going to say, around the issue of why we wrote the book.
Yeah.
Well, I think from my point of view, there was a quite a strong autobiographical background to this, because I grew up on the northern edge of the Northumberland coalfield, and I went down to Bristol for 6 years, came back up to Durham, where I've been for about the last 50. But what struck me, even in the 6 years that I was away, was coming up and down to back to Annie, was that the extent to which the region in those 6 years was changing. Pits were closing, factories were springing up on what had been greenfield sites, railways were closing, roads were opening, and so on. But when I went to Bristol, that was the first experience I had of
All right, he's gone again. Shall I jump in? Because what I guess Ray was going to talk about was the way in which, with the mines closing so dramatically, and in that period, across the country, 400,000 miners left the industry. And there was an attempt to replace. I've been carrying on for you, Ray, about how the new industries were brought in the 60s, and it was the same in Durham as in South Wales, really. And some workers, some of the miners were moved to work elsewhere, and they began to call themselves industrial gypsies. I don't know if.
Yeah, Hugh, I've come back in on my phone. It's easier.
I've just been explaining to the folks what happened in the 60s and how the background to what you had experienced as a student.
Yeah.
And how Durham and South Wales are very similar.
And I think that's one of the things that struck me is that coming back here and living through the next sort of, I suppose, 40 or 50 years, that you had two coalfields that in some respects were very similar, but also were different politically and culturally, but nonetheless sort of gone through the same economic trajectory around an influx of branch plants that didn't stay long, that closed, that didn't provide jobs that were in any way comparable in terms of wages and so on with those that have been in the mines. So while we're talking about a coal industry, there are also important variations between the coal fields. Durham and South Wales shared quite a lot in common because of the nature of the coal that was to be found there, because that influenced how mining methods, influenced markets they could open up and so on. And I guess to go back to something you mentioned and Hilary mentioned, that if you put this together, there was sort of an imperative to, on the one hand, tell the long story, and because of the long period over which these coalfields developed and then declined, but also deep stories to try and tell these stories as much as possible through the voices and the experiences of the people who had lived through them. And that I think became quite a strong motivation in trying to write the book in the way that we wrote it.
Yeah, we're also quite keen that the book wasn't published at £150 and left in libraries. We were very keen that it was distributed widely and organised in discussion sessions, a bit like this one, I suppose. And that was thanks to Verso. And in terms of surprises, I don't know if any of us experienced major surprises, but what I found, and perhaps Ray will say the same in different ways, is that when you go back through this story and write it down and think it through, it isn't so much a surprise, it's actually quite shocking, and for me anyway. And there are kind of particular events that bring that to mind in relation to the care and welfare of the mining workers and their families in this period. The one that often sticks out is what happened in Aberfan in 1966, when the waste tip came down and flooded the village and the school and killed most of the school children. And we saw that as a pointer when one of the grieving fathers went to the coroner's inquest and said that he didn't want death by asphyxiation on the death certificate. He wanted buried alive by the NCB. And that was one of the beginning of a process, I felt anyway, that was both. And I mean, at that time, I don't know if people recall, but Lord Robins, the ex-Labour Minister of Labour, was chairman of the coal board, and he at that day was to be invested as the Chancellor of the University of Surrey, and as a consequence, he wasn't able to get to Aberfan until 48 hours after the accident, and that was felt very, very deeply within that village and within South Wales and across the coalfield. And it's that kind of event that comes to mind, but also others. which reveal aspects of the relationship within the industry and how people came to feel about how they were viewed. And about 15 years ago, I went to the Department of Work and Pensions and gave a talk there. And the audience, one of them said to me that they were kind of very concerned about the level of disability benefits being paid out to ex-miners in these places. And they said to me, by the way you speak, it seems that these people feel that they're entitled to these benefits. And I kind of smiled and said, you should know that most of the miners I talk to still say that Maggie Thatcher stole my job. And this sense of having their livelihoods taken from them was a very powerful thing. And at the same time, I mentioned that they also say that regeneration in the coalfields was being paid for out by the miners themselves, because the miners' pension fund, when the industry was privatized, was underpinned by the state on the condition that the state treasury took over 50% of all profit. This 50-50 split has been questioned many times. It was questioned when the Blair government came in, and it was recommended that it should be 80-20 in favour of the miners. And a similar things happened recently, and in both cases, the Chancellor, Gordon Brown and Sunak, have both said that it won't be done. And this is mine workers receiving a pension of £70 a week. And I could go on through this kind of iceberg of shocking events related to the mining industry and the way in which care that you might think would extend to miners who are working in the more filthy and dangerous work was very limited, really. And the way in which pneumoconiosis was compensated for, and ironically, in the post-mining era, unions have taken the industry to court and the government to court, pressing for compensation for chest illnesses and other events, and the court judgments have been quite dramatic. The judgment by Justice Turner in relation to chronic bronchitis and emphysema was escorticated in relation to the ways in which management in the state-owned industry had prioritized production over duty of care for the workers. And Ray, do you want to say something?
Well, I was going to say, I think, Hugh, the thing that, not a surprise, but the thing that came through very strongly, and it came through strongly in what you've just said, was the sort of cruelty of treatment, the inhumanity of the ways in which people in those places were treated. And I think what sums it up in quite graphic terms, the way in which a variety of injuries and insults were heaped on people in these places, was the way in which a GP in South Shields described the life experience of his patients, and he summed it up in 3 words: shit life syndrome.
Well, he says that all his patients suffered from the same illness, didn't they? And
yeah,
it's this SLS, and I think what you're pointing to there is that the insults that we experienced during the lifetime of the industry have extended into the post or the deindustrialized period, when communities have been subject to raft after raft of pressure.
Yeah, I mean, promises of jobs that never came, cuts to welfare on people who could least cope with those cuts, and cumulatively shit life syndrome. Closures
of facilities, and people. We quote someone who says, "And the butcher shop is shut down," and you think, well, what's with a butcher shop? Well, why don't they go somewhere else? Well, you need public transport or a car, and also the butcher shop is where you talk to people, and it's that kind of detailed way in which life has been altered by a mixture of state policies and policies of capital that have accumulated. And what we try to do in the book, I think, is to show how multi-layered this breakdown of community is, in all the various aspects of it, that have produced this feeling that they there were places that once counted for something, that once, and people get sense of being not only forgotten but deliberately pushed to a side, really, and left. And scrap heap is used a lot as a way of describing where they are. And we aren't doing it justice, I think, but in the story of the book, it's to lead up to this feeling of outrage when they were asked to vote on the European issue.
Yeah.
So Hugh, Ray, I'm going to have to move on, but there'll be a opportunity to come back, and B, people just have to read the book, because it everything. Hugh and Ray could just go on and on, because the book is full of such rich detail. Also, detail of the ways in which miners survived through their own efforts, through their own agency, both through resistance and through creating the kinds of support that are necessary to life. So now I'm going to hand over to Laura to respond. I mean, you in a way have represented millions, or not millions, but thousands of people who've actually had those shit life syndrome, and so it'd be really good to get your comments both on. I mean, you said in your review in Red Pepper how reading this book helped to explain your own defeat and the wider defeat of Labour in these areas. So it'd be good if you could expand that. And then something else you said about how it's a real resource for reclaiming the discourse for the left, and for the left sort of rebuilding, which it is what Ray and Hugh end with. So, Laura.
Yeah, thank you so much, and it's a pleasure really to listen to you both, and huge admiration and respect for taking the time, and I suppose putting so much love into explaining the story of these very, very important communities, and I think it gives that importance to what has happened. And some people might be thinking, well, why is Laura here? And you're right, Hilary, in a sense that it was quite therapeutic to read the book, although much of, and Hugh and Ray have just talked about it, much of it is about the brutality of the industry, and how dirty and how difficult, and the enduring and long-term health conditions from such an industry, and the impact that has on the community, especially when the mines go. I definitely have seen the ravaging that industry has done to people's bodies. And I represented an area, and the book talks about County Durham and lots of communities in County Durham, and goes into detail about the impact and the centrality that the mines had on those communities, that the miners and all of the different aspects of the kind of cultural ramifications of the industry, and how that impacts on everyday life, the centrality and the power that the miners had in terms of influencing and changing decisions at government level, and so much more. And I kind of wrote this in the review of this honestly excellent book. So please people do buy it, especially if you are trying to understand in a less superficial way about what has happened over decades to these communities. Is that for factional reasons, of course, people want to mischaracterize what happened in both the referendum and in 2017 and in the 2019 general election, in particularly what is now being coined red war seats. But of course, Ray and Hugh talk about post-industrial communities or former pit communities, and the mischaracterization, I think, of course, is really an attack on socialist politics, and in a way to say that really that general election in 2019 was some kind of referendum on socialism. Of course, we know it isn't. And the long-term decline, and importantly, explain, and as I say with patience in this book, the cutting or severing of the links between working class communities and an affinity to the Labour Party. But I think fundamentally what that is about the severing or weakening of the industrial political links. And I do think that was an attack on organised labour. It's a consequence of the attack on miners, because there, of course, have been so many different consequences of that, which this book is excellent to try and understand. One of the things that I've definitely observed is that one of the successes of taking on organised labour was that to kind of, in the long term, break that relationship with the Labour Party, or weaken it, or sour it, however you want to put it. But to also try and politically sanitise trade unionism, to take us away from the kind of NUM model of being that not just about inside the workplace, but that kind of looking outwards towards your community, very, very political, and interested and organising around kind of big state and government issues, to then the kind of very important social welfare issues or cultural aspects of the workplace. It's to take that politics away from that kind of trade unionism. And I think that has been a victory of Thatcherism, to move trade unionism. And by the way, you know, we know that that is also a result of decades and decades of very restrictive trade union legislation, which of course is on purpose, politically on purpose, to move trade unionism to try and be about a personal insurance system. So I think I've maybe been asked to review this book for two reasons. Not only because, unfortunately, on that night in December, I saw a Tory, you know, somebody who, you know, I'm not sure he defines as a Thatcherite, but he might, it's irrelevant really, as part of what would be a Boris Johnson government, so like a kind of hard right government, who aren't interested, in my view, in investing in these communities, which this book argues so eloquently means proper investment, not superficial investment. That people voted for that, and the history and the journey to get from that intimate class-based relationship with the Labour Party to voting for a Tory is a complex one, and it certainly is not just about Jeremy Corbyn. It's so important for many reasons, but for socialists to understand that it is completely misguided to think that that result in 2019, especially when you look at the long-term voting trends, which this book does too, and there has been a year-on-year, decade-on-decade kind of break away from the Labour Party for so many reasons, which is to do with legislation, which is to do with stories of the attack on those mining communities and so much more. But of course, to like give us hope as well, that if we really understand what is going on there, what we don't do then is just like lurch to this reactionary, I think it says in the book, kind of flag waving, reactionary nationalism, because what that will not do, sorry, what I'm just going to do is disconnect from my Bluetooth, so I'm being told I'm a little bit muffled. Sorry, that must be annoying. What we must not do, let me just disconnect.
Okay.
Yeah, if you can just let me know in chat if that's a bit better, Ralph. But what we must not do is just kind of accept those superficial solutions to what this book points out are complex problems with a long history. And that is exactly how I feel. And you know, this isn't just about kind of personal salvation. If I had won on that night in December, I certainly wouldn't have thought that was about me, because it would have, of course, been about so much more than that. But losing too was so much more than that. I was tasked with the responsibility to answer lots of the questions that this, and not, you know, lots of the kind of the questions that this book poses about how do you fix that link with industry and politics and work working class people? How do we get back to a class-based sense of identity that is broad and diverse and that is proud? How do we move away from those kind of reactionary ideas that are superficial or just kind of like leveling up? You put a leveling up sticker on something and suddenly there's justice for these post-industrial communities, these former mining communities. Of course not. There has to be genuine understanding and I think compensation for what was done to the people of these communities, because leveling up doesn't kind of compensate for that for all of the injustices that have been done, not least the attack on democracy in the workplace. And I think that is at the heart of this. So yeah, I really do. I'm very proud, by the way, to be asked to speak at this book launch. What an important book at an important time where there is a kind of reorientation or a reforming of the left, when Keir Starmer, in my view, isn't taken on, maybe Keir Starmer should read this book too, but isn't taken on some of the central and important themes in this book to real genuine solutions, and I think those are socialist solutions, about workplace democracy, about proper sectoral collective bargaining of new workforces. You know, there aren't hundreds of thousands of mine workers to organise now, but there are new industries that are in desperate need of organising, and that organising should follow similar methods that look outwards, that look to also involve kind of deep community organising and so much more. But I don't want to say too much more, because I've got a feeling people probably want to hear from Hugh and Ray more, other than to end by saying this is a very, very important book for people on the left who are making very important arguments about where the left goes next, and about what the Labour Party should do next, and about where their own activism should lie. Thanks very much, Hilary.
Thanks, Laura. That was absolutely really inspiring. And just to back it up with this point about the importance of reading the book, Verso and Hugh's point about making it accessible. So Verso are offering a 50% discount for everybody at this launch. So I think Ralph is putting it on the comments. I can read. Oh, it's at bit.ly/40 mine with a capital M, but hopefully that'll be in the comments, Ralph. So we've got masses of really warm comments about the book, including from Jose Ricardo Ramalho in Brazil, and many more, but not that many questions. So could people, now I'll just mention one or two other names: Phil Brown's, somebody called Space Sheep, Tonda Newman. I love this book, a monumental book on the cruelties and barbarism of British capitalism. So, you know, a lot of really wonderful and absolutely accurate comments on the book. So maybe just turn to Hugh and Ray briefly before coming to the few questions we have, while others are composing questions. I mean, you end your book talking about exactly what Laura's saying must be done in terms of building on the capacities in the mining communities. And I just wondered, I mean, I think you said this, that we know from the miners' strike in 84, 85, the huge capacities that exist, both within the mining communities, but also the kind of extent of support across the rest of the country. And it'd be interesting if you could both respond to what Laura said and maybe say a little more about that kind of sense of agency and creativity and capacity in the mining communities that runs through the book, alongside the description of the brutalities and barbarism that you've conveyed already. Anyway, over to you for another.
Go.
Do you want to? Well, I mean, the two examples we give in the book, the way in which, if you like, the post-mining communities have kept on and built upon the traditions and the community strengths, are around the Tower Cooperative in South Wales and the Miners' Dealer in Durham, which in their different ways, I think, illustrate the richness of the resources that potentially are there if you can find the frameworks in which local projects can be supported and developed. And I think it raises important questions about if the policy frameworks are national, for example, what sort of national economic policy would build upon and draw upon and involve the workers in industries, which would think creatively around where you drew the boundaries of what was an industry. If I think back to mining, for example, did it make sense to nationalize the mines but leave the mining machinery companies, which are highly profitable, in the private sector? No, it didn't. So there are a series of issues around how you would think about the role of the state in a long-term transition towards socialist form, because it would have to be long-term. But what sort of form of the state and state policies would support and facilitate and encourage that? And how that could tap into the local cultural resources, the resources of people, and actively involve workers in the new industries that might come into the old coalfield economies. I mean, I think there's some of the things that we were starting to hint at a little bit towards the end. And do you want to say some more about that, Hugh?
Yeah, I suppose something we could say that we have not said yet is and Laura was hinting at it, is the extent to which the mining unionism was quite distinctive and organised politically and culturally, and made mining and mining people, if you like, have a real presence within the community, within British society. And I remember the marches that took place in 92. I ended up behind some women from Cheltenham, and they were saying, well, we're not miners, but we think what's been done to the miners is dreadful. And there was a sense that I remember when the Grunwick picket was on and the miners arrived, the miners had this kind of sense of being something quite distinctive, really. And what's remarkable is how they vanished, and they vanished with a bang, because they had that amazing strike in 84, 85. But what's continued, in addition to what we've said is also these campaigns that they've got. They're still campaigning over the brutality at the Orgreave Court Works, and they're still campaigning to get their fair share of the pension fund. So it's like they are quite distinct as a group in terms of their capacity to maintain and endure and go on, really. And I think what's often missed in this depiction of these places as kind of backwaters is that they are still centres of trade unionism. They are the highest percentage of trade union membership on the coalfields. And that means that there's still a huge kind of sense of collective understanding there, which could be used and built to link into more broader social movements, and in the way that Laura was hinting at. And the maybe slightly romanticized, but we probably saw the film Pride last week, and what that Pride film picks up on is that during the miners' strike there were meetings of people who you'd imagine to be totally disparate, ethnic minority peoples, gay and lesbian peoples, traditional mining peoples, and they actually supported each other and got on. And what's I think terribly troubling about the current situation is that a feeling that the working class has got these huge divisions within it, which can't be built over. And that came to my mind when we talked, Ray, about when the cabin crews were being laid off, and there were television interviews with their experiences of trying to find work, and their experiences were almost identical to how the coal miners described their experiences of being cast out and being too old and this thing, really. So there are and will be ways in which I think links can be made in which I think trade unionism is quite critical to this. And my view is that we are in the process of building, and it's going to be building over the next 20, 30 years, a new kind of labour movement, and which the current one doesn't fit the bill really, and that is. And it would be good to be a part of that.
Yeah.
Move on to the questions that have been building up quite speedily since you began. With
Sorry, talk too long.
No, it's great. So, so there's several. Firstly, from Askan, could you comment on the importance of civic space, like miners' halls and institutes, to previous social and cultural life in mining communities? What could replace these spaces in a post-industrial context? Could community ownership of local assets play a role here? So maybe what I'll read a few of them, and then you could all three come back briefly. I mean, I don't know how strict we need to be. Nobody's going to kick us out of a hall. So probably out of, maybe just, etiquette to everybody, we should finish not much beyond 7, but we could not be absolutely rigid. So the next question is from John Warren. So had Labour not campaigned for a second referendum in 2019, would things have been different? And then Michael, I don't know if it's Michael Calderbank, our Red Pepper advisor, but Michael C. To what extent did miners debate issues of industrial democracy, workers' control, and limits of bureaucratic ownership? And just a final question, then we'll have got them all. People, and this is from Alex Brook, people like Starmer might say this is just a load of romantic nostalgia, but we are now in a new political reality. What do you think? I mean, you've answered some of these questions already in a way, but so you've got about maybe 7 to 10 minutes. If you could all be very, very succinct, as I know you can be.
Okay, I'll just say something quickly. I think romantic nostalgia, it isn't really, and I'd say in a sense the opposite. What it looks at is how a politicized workforce pushed for the nationalization of the industry and comments on their direct experiences of it. And there's real lessons to be learned from that about the future of public ownership. And that issue was debated in the Miners' Union a lot, with the Institute of Workers' Control and Arthur Scargill being on opposite sides. But what was felt very much in that period was that when the state took over the industry, the union felt that it really had to support it for nationalisation to work. And in truth, they ended up supporting the industry far more than they should have in relation to the needs of the workers. In terms of community assets, the answer is definitely yes. Workers' organisations need spaces in spite of the beauty of Zoom. And in terms of the development of trade unionism and politics in the mining areas, having their own buildings was absolutely critical as a way of being able to, the chapels, of course, were the first of them. In terms of the second referendum, it probably would have been different in the mining areas. Whether that would have resolved the question of the political party, I don't know. The result of the election, I don't know. But certainly the issue, as it was in the coalfields, was this situation of neither one thing or the other didn't go down very well, and a feeling that their vote was being disregarded.
Okay, Ray, anything to add?
Well, I'll add one or two things briefly. I would reiterate the importance of civic spaces to meet, because while Zoom and things like this meeting are helpful, I've always thought that getting people around a table in a room when you look at the whites of their eyes is a much, much better way of actually establishing trust, establishing understanding, and if you like, building community. The second referendum, yes, but as Hugh said, bureaucratic ownership, there is what could be a very influential document called the Miners' Next Step, which was, I think, written, Hugh will know the exact date, but I think it was written about 1910, 1912 by some radical miners in South Wales. And as to romantic nostalgia, again, no, definitely not. That's short enough.
Great, no, succinct and to the point. So, Laura.
Yeah, it's just so refreshing. I agree with everything that's being said. I think community spaces it is pivotal to what comes next. I think we have, of course, embraced organising online and communication online, but really, as Ray said, it can kind of only take you so far, especially in terms of attitudinal change, and especially if we're talking about some of the more controversial issues that the left may need to talk about. That actually being there inside the same room in patience and in love and kind of being able to elicit that challenge is much more effective in real life. And of course, to organise in private as well, because lots of the organising that we might want to do is against employers or against politicians or whatever, and that needs space. And lastly, on space, just because I think it's so important, is that we have cultural spaces, we have places, because everything has been privatised. Space has been privatised. You know, we have spaces where working class people can get together and have a good time together, is very, very important. I think door knocking in Northwest Durham would have been a lot easier on some of the doors if we had not asked or said that we would go to a kind of confirmatory referendum, and that actually we stuck by the 2017 principle of respecting the referendum result. That is what I argued vociferously for behind the scenes, but it wasn't to be. But of course, I think other people have already said that it just fed into this idea that people are not bothered. You say you're against the way the establishment behaves, but you are behaving now like the establishment. There was a kind of sniff of deceit, and I think that kind of taps into trust, and I just think that's really, really hard to undo, even though I know we had a policy set of proposals that would have spoken to so many of the issues that this book talks about. And in terms of nostalgia, no, I think that's what actually is kind of thrust upon us by a right-wing framework, a kind of a nostalgic idea of the working class, which is often exclusionary, often doesn't tell the story about the beautiful diversity of working class people, the diversity of opinions in County Durham amongst working class people. It's this very kind of stereotypical idea. And in terms of new political realities, well, we know that. And that is why we are talking about understanding properly what has gone on in these communities, not just saying people reject socialism or people didn't like the way Jeremy Corbyn dressed. It's about actually understanding the intricacies of what happens when an industry is so pivotal and connects to so many different aspects of life, when it is deliberately ended or attacked by the state. What happens? What are the long-term consequences for that, and how does the left respond? So no, it's not nostalgic. The right kind of likes to superimpose that nostalgia, I think, upon us.
Brilliant, all of you. So now we've still got, I mean, the effect of your contributions is to stimulate some more questions, and I just feel we don't want to end. So I'm going to just take the final questions and then have a final word from you. And then we must insist that Verso organise a launch at the next Durham Gala or, in South Wales. Anyway, on to the questions. So the first one is from Ben Sellers, who is another wonderful Durham socialist who used to be the founder and organiser of the People's Bookshop in Durham. And he says, the book is extraordinary. And working for Laura, I agree with her about it's explaining many aspects of our defeat there. On his question, one thing, maybe not directly related to this book, is whether the Corbyn project could have done more to forge these direct links with working class voters and communities. So I think that's a really important question. Perhaps Laura, but also Hugh and Ray could comment on that. And then from Mubu Minor, how important do you think a future book like this should feature an objective view on the Nottinghamshire coalfield, bearing in mind its history and the complications of outcomes there? And then finally from Phil Brown, do you agree the Westminster elite have no connection with former mining areas? So if you could all be brief, maybe pick on one question or two questions that you really want to answer. But we meant to end in 7 minutes. So you've got about 2-3 minutes each. Do you want to start?
Well, I think one of the things that we've identified and written about is this disaffection, this gap between the elites, if you like, and the workers in these places, and it comes up in all sorts of ways. There was a study of health in South Wales that we looked at, and what that came out, health visitors were saying that because the people have lost trust in anybody, they're no longer prepared to go to the doctors. Okay. Now, this is probably changed perhaps by the experience of the COVID epidemic in South Wales. I don't know, but generally there was a loss of faith, if you like, and people might say, you know, to go up to something that Laura pointed out, this long-term decline of the Labour vote in both places. Sometimes you might wonder why they voted at all, really, and there's that sense very much that it's them. Okay, I remember when the Aberfan thing came out, it was said that the pits were inspected every day, and one old chap said to me, "Well, what do you make of them? You know, what do you make of them? You know?" And this estrangement of these parts of the country from the central state is really a significant development, and it's got worse, and it could lead to some quite disastrous ends, I think. So yes, the answer to Phil's question, I think, is that, and I can't really comment on the Corbyn project. I think the Corbyn project got very badly derailed, and I don't know enough about it to know why it wasn't put back on track. But and is there another question?
There's a question about Nottinghamshire.
Yeah, someone's written about that. Yeah, we do write about how Nottingham, although we do write about how Nottingham was historically different from these two places. We do write about how the workforce there systematically voted against the strike action, and for reasons we try to explain. And we also note that the pits in Nottingham were closed as rapidly as anywhere else. So there was, and there is a very good study done in Nottingham. So it was by someone who knows it much better than we do. So it's, but Nottingham is a very important case. It's absolutely central to how the whole politics played out, and perhaps what's happening now as well.
And there's a final question, which maybe I can predict the answer, but do you agree the Westminster elite have no connection with former mining areas?
Short answer is yes. And I think in some ways the Nottingham experience in a way is indicative of the way in which that division which was created within the mining union and encouraged within the mining unions, which was encouraged very actively by government, at the end of the day, looked at retrospectively, just became another device by which a disconnected elite pushed through its project of closing the coal industry. As Hugh said, the pits in Nottingham went as quickly as the pits anywhere else. And in some ways, the memories of the 80s are probably more bitter in Nottingham than in some other places. It demonstrated you can't necessarily, you certainly can't trust a Thatcherite political elite to preserve your job on a coalfield.
Okay, Ray, thanks. Laura, I mean, maybe particularly it'd be good to answer Ben's question about whether the Corbyn project could have done more to forge these direct links with working class communities and voters, because obviously you were on the front line of doing just that, but how far were you constrained, in a sense, by the nature of the Labour Party and even the limits of the Corbyn project and challenging those features of the Labour Party? But anyway, it's up to you.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a little bit about this in the review of the book, that everything I suppose it might feel distant now, but everything that we were doing got sucked up into a vortex of the Brexit referendum, and to be kind of super critical of our own strategy, we shouldn't have allowed that. And I think that goes to the heart of this question. And for full disclosure, Ben Sellers was my political advisor when I was a member of Parliament, and we've talked about this quite a lot, in the sense that, I mean, one of the examples that I'll give is that we wanted to, in the general election, do rally after rally after rally in workplaces, in front of working people. We thought that would kind of be very effective. You had Boris Johnson going to factories in front of workers, very cleverly crafted the imagery, but to kind of, it looked very populist, almost like insurgent, although we know is completely establishment politics. How did we, when I think you talked about it being one of them, all of a sudden I was seen as one of them, as a kind of anti-capitalist socialist, trying to implement sectoral collective bargaining, nationalisation, all that kind of stuff, was turned into the one that was kind of almost counter to the interests of working class people. So yes, we were constrained by the political circumstances, but I think sometimes we confine ourselves, maybe by fear, maybe by kind of an unwillingness to try something new when the stakes are so high, when there's kind of such an assault and an attack on your politics, and there was a consistent attack on Jeremy Corbyn and all of the people close to him. And I think in terms of whether the Westminster elite are kind of out of touch with these communities, I definitely would recommend that those self-proclaimed Thatcherites and the Tories and some members of the PLP who talk very confidently about red wall seats, sometimes just to kind of really elevate their own politics kind of for convenience, to not really look at some of those kind of deep-rooted issues, should read a copy of this book, because I don't want these communities to be messed about with anymore for political gain. We genuinely need, as I talked about before, proper investment, of course, nationalisation, and I think compensation for these areas. So yeah, everybody should read In the Shadow of the Mine if you're a member of the PLP and going to talk about red wall communities.
Brilliant. Well, I think we're going to have to end there. We're just a minute over time, but I think we've got to have a face-to-face discussion, carrying on in a way the kind of unanswered questions. Well, they're half answered, but now the answer lies in practice, really, and learning from that practice. So as the book ended, I think quoting a miner saying, we inherit the past, the future we build. So we must now go and build and attempt to make use of whatever spaces we have to do so. So thanks all of you, and thanks for the contributors, both the panelists but also the participants. And see you at next year's Gay Level. Thanks a lot. And thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks for writing the book.
Yeah, thanks for writing the book. And everybody must buy it using the bargain that Verso's offering. Thanks.